Hello, this is Jay Mitchell, and we are back with another episode of the Libertarian Censored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Censored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have U.S. is sending an aircraft carrier to Latin America in major escalation of military buildup from APnews.com, posted by LegioX. And yeah, personally, I don't think the U.S. should be sending aircraft carriers to foreign countries. But regardless, the U.S. is going to justify what it wants to justify. It's interesting because Trump markets himself as an anti-war president, but he's just as warmongering as the rest of them. He'll do whatever the military-industrial complex says to do, and this is an example of that. Next, we have Stephen Miller threatens to arrest J.B. Pritzker and state officials. Also tells ICE officers, you have federal immunity. Anybody who lays a hand on you or tries to stop or obstruct you is committing a felony. Posted by Ragnar OKXG. And that's a cross post from the Law subreddit. And that looks like I guess Stephen Miller saying that on Fox News. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that rhetoric, but I'm sure if it was the other way around, and J.B. Pritzker said, "Oh, you should be able to arrest any ICE agents you want to," Reddit thinks I think he did say that. Reddit thinks that's the greatest thing ever, and it just goes to show you, Reddit will justify any authoritarianism the in-group says to justify, demeaning any authoritarianism coming from the out-group, and this is a good example of that. They think Stephen Miller is the worst thing ever because, he wants to arrest all the illegal immigrants, but Reddit, since the illegal immigrants are in group rather than out group, Reddit feels that's duty bound to protect them. I'm sure if there was a woke version of Steve Miller in a Democrat administration that said, "Oh, we gotta arrest all the hateful, anti-racist, homophobic, transphobic, whatever ever phobic bigots," Reddit would be all over it. But since they only really care about who's in the in group and who's in the out group, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Trump considering plans to target cocaine facilities inside Venezuela, officials say, from CNN Politics, from edition.cnn.com, posted by Ninja Lover. And yeah, personally, I don't think they should be doing that, but the U.S. government has legal monopoly and needs to force justify bombing pretty much whoever it wants to. If I bombed the Middle East for decades, I'd be held up as an international war criminal, but the U.S. government does it, and it's pretty much just every part for the course. And it just goes to show you, it doesn't really matter, what force is being used, rather who is using that force. And since the state has the legal monopoly and the force, they can get away with pretty much bombing wherever they want to, oftentimes without any repercussions whatsoever. I remember back in, I think it was May when they bombed Iran, maybe it was June, somewhere around there. Everyone was like, "Oh, this is the worst thing ever." But now people have already forgotten about that. Now they're gonna bomb, and it looks like they're gonna bomb Venezuela, and I'm sure that will be on the news cycle for a day or two before it will blow over, and people will move on to the next thing. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have White House website posts topless pic of trans woman in response to critics of East Wing destruction. Then in parentheses, MAGA obsession of trans people's bodies never ends, and to every bedroom they must go, from LGBTQNation.com, posted by CH4Locks. And yeah, they always add the parentheses points so they can subvert a circle joke or whatever the post is. But regardless, personally, I don't really care for, the White House constantly circle jerking itself on social media and the internet in general, posting stuff like, "Oh, Hunter Biden got caught with cocaine here in the White House. Here's Bill Clinton's with the Monica Lewinsky scandal. And here's when Biden had a topless trans woman over." Personally, I think it's kind of tiring, but, it's very much... that's very much what social media is at this point. Tiring. It's the same circle jerking, talking points over and over again, and eventually it's kind of just grow numb to it all. Personally, if the White House wants to circle jerk its talking points on its official website, I guess they should be able to do so since it's their website. But personally, I think the argument here is we probably shouldn't have any government websites at all, since they're going to be inherently biased to whatever the person in power thinks they should be biased towards. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have, mention this and they carefree branding, are you a right-wing conspiracy theorist? Posted by Swamp Yankee Dan, and that's a cross post from the Work Reform subreddit. And that looks like a tweet from a guy, Gary Garrod. If there's an oil crisis and oil companies are making record profits, a healthcare crisis and healthcare companies are making record profits, a financial crisis and finance companies are making record profits, then the companies are the crisis. And yeah, personally, I would kind of agree with that. I think the libertarian perspective is, right now we don't really have true capitalism. We have crony capitalism, where big business and big government collude to control the market rather than have a truly free market. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is we need the government out of oil, healthcare, and finance, and that's why we have all these oil, healthcare, and finance companies making record profits because they're colluding with the government to give themselves the best deals. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Venezuela's Maduro says the U.S. is fabricating war and seeks to revoke citizenship of opponent from APnews.com, posted by Ninja Lover. And they added the quote, I think it's a quote from their article. They are fabricating an extravagant narrative of vulgar, criminal, and totally fake one, Maduro added. Venezuela's country does not produce cocaine leaves. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for Maduro, but, I think he's hit the nail on the head right here. The U.S. clearly just wants regime change in Venezuela, just like it wants regime change in pretty much every country in the world that doesn't control. And yeah, I personally don't care for Maduro. I'd be fine if the Venezuelan people are for him, but I don't think the U.S. should play a role in that. And that's pretty much what they openly want to do at this point. They want to overthrow him by installing maybe a color revolution, like they did in Ukraine or a lot of the former Soviet republics. And yeah, personally, I don't think it's the U.S.'s job to overthrow him, but the U.S. has to get involved in foreign affairs of every country in the world, and that's not something I particularly care for. Next, we have Today's America, and that's supposed to be run by CH4Locks. That's a cross-post from the cringe TikTok subreddit, which looks like it's since been removed by moderator. And I think that was a video of some ICE troops trying to drag a protester over the line. And yeah, personally, I don't think ICE troops or or the National Guard or whoever it was, whatever branch of law enforcement that tried to drag a person over the line, the blue line, should have been doing that. But ultimately, the law enforcement has the legal monopoly and force to justify using its force however it feels like. And yeah, personally, I think a lot of these protesters, they go, oh, this is the new Gestapo. Well, in reality, I think the libertarian position is, if you want to get involved and yell stuff at them and protest them, that's fine. But if you get really in their face, it's not, that's, and purposely try to agitate them, I don't think that's personally a very good idea, but just by doing whatever you want to, I personally don't think agitating law enforcement is that good an idea, though, especially when they have legal monopoly on these force just by doing whatever they feel like, and that could result in you being killed for all you know. But regardless, I personally would just rather avoid the cops or whatever law enforcement unless I absolutely need them, rather than purposely trying to agitate them like they're doing here. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have, since dear leader said the sky is pink, according to the GOP, it's time to gouge your lying eyes, posted by CH4Locks, and that's cross-post from the cringe TikTok subreddit, Trump accusing Canada of cheating on a commercial. And yeah, personally, I don't really care how Canada is using Ronald Reagan to justify, their talking points. It's interesting. Reddit usually hates Ronald Reagan, but they like how Canada's using him in an ad to push anti-terrorist talking points. I personally am more on the anti-terrorist side, but it's just people are going to do whatever suits their agenda, and this is a good example of that. People are always going to be inherently self-interested. Canada's going to be against the terrorists because, not because they like free trade, but because they, want cheap American goods. And so they're gonna try and find talking points that support that view. Well, Reddit is only going to care about Orange Man Bad. If Orange Man Bad was anti-tariff, Reddit would think tariffs were the greatest thing ever. But since he's pro-tariff, Reddit thinks tariffs are the worst thing ever, which I would agree with. But they only say that because Orange Man says, or they only think that because Orange Man says the opposite. I'm sure if Orange Man said, "Don't go jump off that bridge over there," all the Redditors would be piling off that bridge faster than you could blink your eyes. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Venezuela's Maria Corina Machado wins Nobel Peace Prize for standing up to socialism from Reason.com, posted by Socialists Are Morons, and they added more deserving than Obama, but that's a low bar, of course. And I'd agree with that. Personally, I like this Machado fella. She seems like she is a principled resistance against Maduro. But regardless, I think she shouldn't be having any American help in regards to overthrowing the dictatorship of Venezuela. I think she should be trying her best to form a natural movement rather than have an astroturf movement by the U.S. government, like it usually seems to happen whenever the U.S. government wants regime change. An astroturf movement always seems to pop up that tries to overthrow the regime. It's happened in like Iran and Ukraine and a lot of countries. But yeah, personally, I do like Machado, but she could be. I wouldn't be surprised if she was on the payroll of the CIA and working for the U.S. government as well. But with that being said, if I were her, I disavow the U.S. just like I disavow Maduro and socialism, just because the U.S. and her agree that Maduro isn't good doesn't mean that you should be taking all the U.S. CIA money as well. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have ramping up plans to steal the midterms, and he's getting more bold about it, posted by Ragnar OKXG, and that's a cross post from the real Twitter account Subra, and that looks like a true from Donald Trump. What's worse, the NBA players cheating at cards and probably much else, or the Democrats cheating on elections? The 2020 presidential election being rigged and stolen is a far bigger scandal. Look what happened to our country when a crooked moron became our quote-unquote president. We now know everything. I hope the DOJ pursues this with as much gusto as befitting the biggest scandal in American history. If not, it will happen again, including the upcoming midterms. No mail-in or quote-unquote early voting. Yes to voter ID. Watch how totally dishonest the California prop vote is. Millions of ballots being quote-unquote shipped. Get smart Republicans before it's too late. And yeah, personally, I think it's interesting. Trump can say elections are rigged, and Reddit thinks it's the worst thing ever. But I like the title of this post: "Ramping up plans to steal the midterms." And he's getting more bold about it. It's completely fine when Reddit cries fraud when their side loses, but when Trump cries fraud, it's the worst thing ever. And yeah, personally, I definitely however good the Democrats are going to do in next year's midterms, I definitely don't think it will be good enough for Reddit, and they'll say that the election is stolen. And yeah, personally, I think the only way out of this is, either have open ballot where people can't lie about who they voted for, you can easily track every vote, or just get rid of democracy entirely, because democracy is just enforcing your values on other people, and I don't think that's very libertarian. I think if people want to have a voluntary collectivist democracy where they're like a group and everyone can vote and people will accept the results of the vote, I think that's fine. But right now, when you only have one government for a massive swath of land, that's going to lead to inherent tyranny of majority, like we're seeing now. I think it's interesting. Reddit says, "Oh, we love democracy," but they're completely fine with it when it elects they hate it when it elects Donald Trump. And it just goes to show you that, they can't even use "he lost the popular vote this time" as an excuse. It just goes to show you democracy is tyranny in the majority. And if Reddit was truly principled and anti-Trump, they'd be against that. They'd be against it because, that's the reason Trump's in power currently, because of a democratic election. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Malay's party wins election in Argentina, posted by Ninja Lover, and that looks like a YouTube video from Al Jazeera English. Malay's party wins high-stake Argentina elections, early results show. And yeah, personally, I like Malay. I've kind of soured on him recently, though, since he's taking America's bailout money. But regardless, I do think he was still probably the best option over the Peronis and whoever the third party was. I think they were called, like, United Provinces or something. But yeah, of course, Reddit's not going to like Malay now since he's taking ballot money from the Donald, and Reddit has to hate anyone who's associated with Trump because, that's Reddit's MO at this point. It's the Reddit's MO is, orange man bad, and all its political beliefs extend from that. Reddit always has to be against whatever orange man does. It's like how the Democratic Socialists of America had said, "Oh, the Trump's Israel-Gaza peace plan didn't go far enough." But I'm sure if it was Biden doing the same peace plan, Reddit would think it's the greatest thing ever. And yeah, that's my thoughts on that issue. And we have "Who is filling Trump full of all this bullshit?" posted by Ragnar OKXG, and that's cross was from the Midas Touchdown Bread, and it's a truth from Donald Trump on True Social. "After winning free elections by a lot, I am now going the best polling numbers I have ever received. People see how strong the economy is, the trillions of dollars investment pouring into our country, the record-setting strong border, after years of millions of criminals pouring through it, totally embedded and unchecked, ending 8 wars in 8 months, no men playing in women's sports, no transgender for everyone, rapidly falling energy prices, and much more. Despite all of this, the radical left losers are taking fake ads, not showing real polls, but rather saying that I'm polling at low levels. These are the people that I've been beating for years, and I'm continuing to do so, but by even bigger margins. These ads should not be allowed to run because they are fake." And he wrote "fake" in all caps with an exclamation point. And yeah, personally, they're saying "who's filling Trump full of all this bullshit?" I personally think that's just Trump and his own delusions. He's always kind of been very delusional, and I think the elections have only made it seem worse with all the how much support he's getting despite completely always acting like a delusional spaz. But regardless, if he wants to say this, I think that's fine. I personally do think, but ads should. I like how he says these ads should not be allowed to run because they're fake. Ultimately, I think any people should be able to run whatever ads they want. Political ads have always been misleading and kind of designed to be biased to whoever side they're from. But regardless, I'm sure if it was a Democratic president saying this, Reddit would think it's the greatest thing ever, and they'd say, we do have to get rid of those fake ads. We can't let hate speech and misinformation be legal because, it's interesting, when Reddit says, oh, we're the free speech platform, we hate when Jimmy Kimmel gets censored, but Reddit was for censorship for years when Sleepy Joe was in power. And it's to go show you, people say they're anti-censorship, but it's really just because their party's not in power. If their party was in power, they justify whatever censorship they'd ever feel like. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have, this Virginia company says Donald Trump's tariffs make rational business planning impossible, from Reason.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, I would agree with that. I think, the tariffs, I think they might be well-intentioned, trying to, encourage people to buy local. But, I think they do go against a truly free market, and the libertarian position should be against them. And we have everyone looking at Argentina right now, but I'm looking at Falklands, posted by Yulo Sandpiper, and that looks like a picture of Charles III of England, and it says Falklands watching Argentina get bailed out. Will they still have a deal with Starmer's fringe government? And yeah, I'd agree with that. Personally, I don't really care for the UK government right now. I think it's probably one of the worst in the world, definitely the Western world. But ultimately, the Falklands wants to be under UK rule rather than Argentina rule. Ultimately, that's self-determination. People are going to vote for being under whatever tyrannical power they feel like, and that just goes to show we shouldn't have the people tell us what government we are or aren't under. We should be able to say we're under our own governance. That's why I think I'm surprised the libertarian movement doesn't have a lot more crossover with the sovereign citizen movement, because we both kind of have a lot of the same goals. Don't let the government push you around and tell you what to do just because they have the legal monopoly on the use of force. Then we have Jimmy Dore and Joe Rogan talking about conspiracy against GHB, posted by YSHDRP, and that's cross post from the GHB info subreddit. Jimmy Dore and Joe Rogan talking about GHB. Will the conspiracy against it ever stop? And then they added an inscription. Jimmy Dore talking about GHB if Joe Rogan isn't exposing what the government did to it. GHB is a non-toxic, naturally occurring substance with decades of research to treat a variety of health issues, and even improve lifespan and overall health due to its sleep-enhancing effects. Now they even have an extended-release version called Lumras, which ends with any type of excuses to not prescribe it for chronic insomnia. Should we start a new petition so it might reach RFK Jr.? It's complete BS what they did and still do to it, because the health benefits of GHB, when used medicinally and responsibly, are far, far greater than whatever could happen when people use it irresponsibly. It's their fault. It's insane that I happen to be suffering for years to be given terrible drugs that actually don't really help or work and have very dangerous side effects like prolonged QT syndrome and many others. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian perspective here is, if you want to think GHB is the worst thing ever and don't want to take it, I think you should be able to. If you don't think it's the best thing ever and want to take it as much as you want, I think you should be able to. That's very much the libertarian perspective on any drug or substance whatsoever. Do whatever you want for your own body. I personally wouldn't be shooting up heroin all day or any other illicit drugs and tripping out in the street all day, but, ultimately justify doing whatever you feel like as long as you're not hurting anyone else but yourself. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have, you're dead liberal, federal agents threatens to shoot veteran, from NewRepublic.com, posted by Ninja Lover. And yeah, personally, I think, I don't think a federal agent should be saying that, but, you're definitely presented with a biased picture here. The veteran might have been purposely agitating him, and I don't think he's in the clear either. Ultimately, as I said earlier, you should, personally, I don't really care for law enforcement's legal monopoly and use of force, but, I don't think agitating him is probably the best thing to do either, especially if you get them to say something like this, and then you can use it as a gotcha. Well, you're just being an agitating little bitch. And, I personally don't really care for law enforcement, but, agitating them like a little bitch isn't something that, I think you should be doing either. You should just, if you want to if you want to protect yourself against something, that's fine. But you shouldn't just be agitating them for a little bit. You should be staying out of their way rather than actively getting involved in their affairs. And maybe if you want to protect, if they're trying to arrest someone you don't think they should be arresting, you want to try and stop them. Ultimately just starting whoever you want to. But personally, I think you should be probably looking out for yourself first and foremost. And that's why I personally don't think you should be trying agitating them or getting involved in them unless you absolutely need to. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have, not even Congress knows how much money Doge cut or in their premises or stolen, posted by CH4Locks, and that's crossed from the Fed News subreddit. And yeah, personally, I do think Doge was probably one of the bright spots for libertarianism this year. With that being said, of course, Reddit has to be against it since it's associated with Orange Man. But yeah, I do think hopefully that we did cut some government spending, even if it was mostly performative rather than actually substantial. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Jerome Powell just gave a blunt warning. The U.S. federal government is on an unsustainable fiscal path. Debt is growing faster than the economy. Posted by CH4Locks, and that's crossovers from the economy subreddit. And that's Jerome Powell saying that on 60 Minutes. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that, but neither party really cares about the national debt when they're in charge. The Republicans were concerned when Biden was in office, but then they took power and just kept spending like there's no tomorrow. And yeah, it just goes to show you how, people, both parties might market themselves as trying to be as fiscally responsible as possible, but neither of them really is. Next, we have being quote-unquote on the right in 2025, something to be ashamed of, posted by Comfortable Pool 4684, and they added, I'm a practical libertarian. I don't feel like programs and methods should be ended overnight. I believe this administration is reckless and MAGA is making being on the right something to be ashamed of. I don't think I want to be considered on the right, haha, because the right has been hijacked. How long do you think it will take to rebuild the reputation of the quote-unquote the right? And yeah, personally, I think people get way too concerned about labels when it comes to politics, on the left, on the right, etc., etc. Personally, if you think MAGA's put a good bad name for on the right, want to act as, I think that's fine. But, ultimately, the libertarian perspective is, I think we should stop being so obsessed about labels and start caring about individual liberty, regardless of what people label themselves as. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have U.S. detains British commentator Sami Hamdi in the middle of national speaking tour from CNN.com, hosted by Ninja Lover, and they added, abducting a prominent British Muslim journalist and political commentator on a speaking tour in the United States because he dared to criticize the Israeli government's genocide is a blatant affront to free speech. And I'd agree with that, but it just goes to show you, the U.S. government has a legal monopoly on the use of force, justify doing pretty much whatever it feels like. If they want to arrest you for criticizing Israel, they can, and that's pretty much one of the biggest reasons. One of my biggest gripes with the GOP currently is that they're clearly in Israel's pockets, but the Democratic Party isn't much better in that regards. They're very much in Israel's pockets too. Next, we have largest federal workers union side of Republicans on government shutdown from WashingtonPost.com, posted by socialists or morons. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for the current government shutdown, but regardless, it's just kind of false advertising. If there's a government shutdown, I'm thinking of something like The Purge, where you can murder with impunity and there's no law enforcement or any government services whatsoever. But right now, the government's pretty much deemed all of its services essential, and they've only cut very, very minimal services. So, I personally think the term government shutdown, as it's being used currently, is frankly false advertising. Next we have, is the United States a capitalist country? Why or why not? Posted by Godwin Knob. And they said, I've seen many people excuse the shitty inequity of our present society as solely a consequence of government interference in the market. It appears to me that in their mind that capitalism has not been seen. Thus the questions, I want to understand what makes capitalism capitalism. And I would say capitalism is capitalism because of a truly free market. Right now we don't have capitalism. We have crony capitalism, which might as well be socialism or communism, where big government and big businesses are colluding to hoard all the wealth for themselves, rather than, let the market be truly free. And I would start saying in a lot of aspects that's even worse than socialism or communism, because, it's at least socialism or communism are open about how they're the government control of the market. The crony capitalism still tries to market itself as capitalism when it's truly not. And that's my thoughts on that issue. And next we have Johnson claims SNAP contingency funds not legally available from thehill.com, posted by Dr. Who 07. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for SNAP or any government welfare program. But, ultimately, I do think, if people want to pay in for a program like SNAP, I think they should be able to. I think they should, but right now, with under forced taxation, people taxpayers' money might be going wherever they feel like, might be going to wherever the government feels like, might be going to Argentina, Ukraine, or Israel, rather than staying in the U.S. I think, First of all, the tax money should be staying in the U.S. I do think SNAP is probably one of the better uses of government funds, but regardless, if the government doesn't feel like they can pay for it, then ultimately, it's not going to pay for it. And that's why I think, even if you are on government benefits, you should try to be as less reliant on government benefits as possible. I personally am on some government benefits, but, I do try and be as less as self-reliant as possible, because ultimately the government can take away whatever benefits it gives you at any second, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. And that's my thoughts on that issue. And then I had another post I want to share that I posted to the Libertarian Party USA subreddit. I said Congress, it was an article from Reason.com, and it was Congress investigates T on her app for letting men post about women without their consent from Reason.com. And I said, we need to protect women, and secondly, we need to protect children as a justification for government authoritarianism. Also love how this is being put forward by GOP representatives, and it's usually the kind of woke censorship that the party rallies against. I guess this is a time when America's top quote-unquote neo-Nazi is a Catholic Hispanic guy, and, Nick Fuentes. And, it just goes to show you, I personally don't think you should be posting stuff on the internet about other people without their consent, but, everyone on the internet's constantly doing stuff without your consent, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about it, just because, something is scummy isn't an excuse for government censorship. And that's my thoughts on that issue. So I think we're gonna wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.